one. But I know you're all here tonight for the presentation, which is going to be a good one. You know, it's always great to hear Ty present and speak about local sports history. He is kind of the leading sports historian in the community and throughout Central Washington. He's done presentations across the state, like in Seattle with the Northwest African American History Museum, and also nationally, where he spoke at the Negro League Museum in Kansas City. He is the author of Darkhorse, the Jimmy Claxton Story, and he's also working on a book about deaf baseball players in Washington State. He graduated with a degree in history and comparative religion under the guidance of mentor Dr. Raeburne Heimbeck at Central Washington University, where he was also part of the William O. Douglas Honor College. Please join me in welcoming Ty Phelan, our tonight's presenter.
Thank you all for coming. I've attended Mariner games with less people. So I'm excited about the turnout. Thank you. Thank you to Kittitas County Historical Museum and Director Sadie Thayer for hosting this event. As she said, my name is Ty Phelan. I'm a local author and historian. I wrote Darkhorse, the Jimmy Claxton Story. And today I'll be speaking about African American baseball in Central Washington prior to the integration of the major leagues by Jackie Robinson. Robinson once said, "A life is not important." Robinson once said, "A life is not important except on the impact it has on other lives." Long before those words were spoken, African American baseball pioneers were making history and rewriting record books right here in Central Washington. Here are brief biographies of key players and teams in Kittitas and Yakima counties. I'll be generous with the geographical boundaries of Central Washington, as I'll be including one story about a player from Stevens County and another story about players in South Central Washington, Hanford area. Okay. It's difficult to discuss African American history in Washington State without starting with this gentleman right here, James Edward Shepperson. Originally from Virginia, he stood over 6 feet tall, weighed nearly 300 pounds, with a forceful personality to match his physical presence. He was a labor recruiter for the Northern Pacific Coal Company. Big Jim and 50 African American strikebreakers first arrived in Roslyn, Washington, August 17, 1888. They were not well received. This was routine from 1888 to 1912. With assistance from Shepperson, the coal companies hired nearly 2,000 black laborers from the East and the Midwest in order to cross picket lines at various mining locations throughout the Cascades. They were used as leverage in contract negotiations. By 1910, the population of Roslyn was nearly 20% African American. Almost 1,000 African Americans lived in the small town. These men and women brought with them the 3 B's: the Bible, barbecue, and baseball. The first building erected in Roslyn was the AME Church. Erected shortly after their arrival in 1888, the AME Church served as a cultural center, but also as the first public schoolhouse in Roslyn. It was integrated, and it lasted as a schoolhouse in Roslyn from 1888 until 1892. Churches in Yakima as well as Ellensburg were founded well before 1907. One of the most well-attended events every summer was the African American holiday, Emancipation Day. The August 4th celebration brought more than 1,000 attendees of all nationalities for a traditional community barbecue every year. Beef, whole hogs, chicken, and mutton were slow roasted in a covered pit for hours. This technique was frequently commented on in local newsprint because it was fascinating to a lot of the individuals around there. Covered open pit barbecue was not experienced by Central and Eastern European immigrants. Here's a photo of the Labor Day event. This is September 1st, 1912. This is only 4 months after the United Mine Workers integrated. Now, the integration of the United Mine Workers was a double-edged sword. While it gave African Americans equal pay to their white counterparts, it also did not call for reinforcements of black laborers in order to break future strikes. This is Roslyn baseball field. This is about 1907. There's been a Roslyn baseball diamond at Roslyn's Pioneer Park for 130 years. Though not always in the same location, it's moved from one corner of the park to the other. This is about where the kids' playground is down at Pioneer Park, in that corner. The railroad tracks are running right behind the grandstand there on Railroad Avenue. Sorry. This was the best ballpark in all of the Upper County. That's because in Cle Elum, they built a ballpark in Cle Elum in 1904, and in 1908 it suffered an accidental detonation. Brilliant city planners decided to build the grandstand for the ballpark on top of the powder magazine used for storing blasting materials for the mine. And the inevitable happened, and a spark ignited half a ton of dynamite, killing 8 people, and sending the grandstands and the outfield fence like shrapnel all over town. In some instances, the league was literally a powder keg. It was a toxic atmosphere, to say the least. The first recorded baseball game in Kittitas County history was between the Roslyn Town team and African-American miners from mine number 3 near Ronald. It was a controversial Roslyn victory. The prize purse offered that day was $300 in 1890, which is about $8,000 today. For just a simple baseball game between town teams, that seems like quite the rivalry. This is John Golden. John Goldie Golden was born in Washington, D.C., July 18, 1880. He was a sergeant in the 9th Cavalry. The Buffalo Soldier was a Spanish-American War and Philippine insurrection veteran. His unit, the 9th, served alongside Roosevelt's Rough Riders at the Battle of San Juan Hill. After the war, he and his wife Alice moved to Kittitas Valley in 1903. He was a porter at the Northern Pacific Railroad Station for 40 years, just down the street. The couple lived in Ellensburg's restricted district. The restricted district was a section of town designated for blacks, Asians, Native Americans. It was essentially south of Main, south of 3rd, west of Main, and east of Nanham Streets. Their home was at 105 North Water Street. It would have been adjacent to the pallet factory and across the street from the Fred Meyer parking lot. The few shacks that peppered the district were eventually moved to a single location at the 100 block of South Water Street. I believe today it's the Early Bird Cafe down there, but if you go down to that corner across the street from Fred Meyer, you'll see 4 or 5 different shacks that have been all moved to one property. And those were actually the last few of the restricted district that were left around and then moved to that single location decades ago. Golden was a member of the 1906 Ellensburg Colts baseball team. He was a 3rd baseman on the team. This photo was taken by local photographer Otto Potsky and submitted to the 1907 Spalding Baseball Guide, probably without the editors realizing that the team was integrated. This right here is John Golden down in the corner, and they probably just didn't recognize it. The Colts played in the short-lived Yakima Kittitas League with 3 other teams, the North Yakima Tigers, the Prosser Elks, and the Toppenish Indians. There were some interesting players in the league. Teammate Nick Daviscourt, right here, he wrestled for the World Heavyweight Championship twice in 1921 and 1935. Both bouts he lost, unfortunately. The North Yakima Tigers had a third baseman named Royal Hunky Shaw. Hunky had one at bat for the 1909 Pittsburgh Pirates. But he's probably better known, the Shaws were better known as furniture manufacturers, and they owned a funeral home in Yakima. Of course, relatives of the Shaws opened Shaw's Furniture here in Ellensburg. Golden continued to play baseball for Ellensburg's segregated team after the Yakima Kittitas League folded. It folded after only 9 games, unfortunately. He continued to play for the segregated team in Ellensburg. In 1912, the Ellensburg and North Yakima black baseball teams faced off to raise funds in order to rescue the local AME church. More than 400 people attended the event, where Ellensburg Mayor Mahan addressed attendees. The event was said to be a success in every regard. Here's the Ellensburg lineup here. Many of the names you can't even find out who they are. You'll only find not last names, but some of the players were identifiable in this game. Notice these men's addresses. These are from the 1911 to 1912 Ellensburg City Directory. All of these men lived within 1-2 blocks of each other. They're all on South Main to 1st and 2nd or North Water. That same restricted district area. They were mostly menial laborers, despite their skill sets, experience, or even longevity in the valley. For instance, Reverend Grattan of the AME Church was also the janitor at the Antlers Hotel. He moved to Ellensburg in 1878, when the Chinese trading post was still known as Robert's Roost, and led the congregation through financial troubles off and on until 1924. John Golden's wife, Alice Golden, they were married for 26 years. She passed away in 1926, but she was regarded as one of the most well-known citizens in all of Ellensburg when she did die. She's buried at the IOF Cemetery off Fenton and Brick Road. We recently uncovered her gravesite. This was completely buried by the hillside that had sloughed off over the years. Finding her headstone was excellent, and we probably were the first people to visit her gravesite in 50 years. They were married 30 years. Alice and John had no children, but they adopted a daughter, Jen Beatty. Jen Beatty was an outfielder for a team called the 1938 Seattle Owls, which was a women's black baseball team. So he obviously passed on some of his skill sets on the baseball diamond to his adopted daughter. John Golden is he moved to Los Angeles late in his life. In the late 1940s, he passed away in 1951. He is one of only 100 Buffalo soldiers buried at Los Angeles National Cemetery. A lot of the early black baseball players were soldiers as well, Buffalo soldiers primarily. The 25th Infantry and their famous baseball pitcher, Ike Ward, landed in the Spokane area in 1910 and stayed there until 1912. Ward was a sergeant in Company M. He served in the United States Army for 5 years and 8 months. And one half of this unit, the 25th, was stationed in Fort Lawton, Seattle. And the other half was stationed in Fort George Wright, Spokane. Now, the experiences were very different. The soldiers in Fort Lawton were in frequent contact with the police, while the soldiers at Fort George Wright were local heroes. The Buffalo soldiers stationed at Fort George Wright gained notoriety for their heroics and sacrifices as frontline firefighters in the most catastrophic wildfire in U.S. history. In just 2 days, August 20th and 21st of 1910, high winds swept a massive inferno known as the Devil's Broom Fire across 3 states, Washington, Idaho, and Montana, burning 3 million acres. Entire towns were vaporized. 87 people were killed, including 78 firefighters and 3 fellow Buffalo soldiers from the 25th Infantry. The grateful citizens of the town that Ward and the 25th saved, Wallace, Idaho, and I quote, "My whole attitude about the black race has changed as a result of what I've seen and witnessed from these fellows." So they had an immediate impact on the local community in Spokane, and their biggest public relations arm was, of course, their baseball team. Their baseball team, only in the area for 2 years, they played at Natatorium Park. Now, Natatorium Park was the home of the Spokane Indians. They played in the Northwestern League. Black baseball teams were not allowed to play in Pacific Coast League parks in Seattle and Tacoma. But the Spokane Indians were in the Northwestern League, which was slightly more progressive. And management regularly lent the grounds to the regiment's baseball team, as well as the Spokane Colored Giants, and barnstormers such as the Chicago American Giants and Kansas City Monarchs when they came through town. Satchel Paige, of course, pitched at Natatorium Park in 1928. In January of 1913, the 25th Infantry was reassigned overseas, to Hawaii specifically, and Ward decided to remain in north central Washington. He wrote the managers of the baseball team in Colville, where the 25th had played previous seasons, and his assistant was really welcomed in town. He was immediately appointed the manager of the Stevens County League semi-pro Colville Indians, which he held onto that position from 1913 to 1916. And he was almost certainly the first African-American manager of a white baseball team in the history of the national pastime. Very little is known of Ward outside that brief 6-year window of baseball when he was in north central and eastern Washington. But the majority of his life remains quite a bit of a mystery. Ward, predictably, Ward's leadership in Colville was met with hostility by other town teams. The manager of the Kettle Falls Club heard that Ward would be in the box. He protested on the grounds that it was right for Colville to play with or against a N-word, but that it was far beneath the dignity of his team to stoop to this level. Now read the quote and then tell me who is the more dignified of those individuals in that statement. Of course, there ended up being no game that day. But aside his job on the mound, Ward was the Boy Scout troop leader, the ballpark supervisor, as well as the high school and youth baseball coach. He attempted to open a bootblack stand in Colville, but was rebuffed by local officials who refused to grant him the building permit necessary. After several years of success on the baseball diamond, but frustration with local politics, he returned to Houston, where he was raised, where he seems to have led a pretty quiet life until he passed away in 1949. It's just a real shame that he's not remembered for his contributions to the game as the first African-American manager of a white baseball team, but that is how history has written him down. Incredibly, Ward was not the only African-American to integrate a team in the North Central Washington League, in Stevens County League. Simultaneously, Hume LaPrince Batiste may be one of the most bizarre stories in Pacific Northwest sports history. He passed as Native American and integrated an impressive list of semi-professional, minor league, and professional ball clubs such as the 1914 Colts, the Helena Vigilantes, Calgary Broncos, Springdale Reds, Afraid Tigers, and the Spokane Indians. That was astonishing enough. That was a very astonishing feat for its time and day, what have you. But what's more incredible is Hume did this while he was a deaf mute. His incredible family history has been traced and compiled by baseball historian Ronald Author, who writes for a sports blog called the Shadow Ball Express. His family history is amazing. Batiste's grandfather, Dr. Hume, was the owner of many rice plantations around Charlotte, South Carolina, and he practiced a repugnant southern tradition known as placage or plaquage. It was essentially a left-handed marriage to an African-American concubine or a slave. The most famous example of this is, of course, Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. These relationships were often brutal and abusive, just terrible. Dr. Hume was a chemistry professor at the Citadel Military Institute. His knowledge of chemistry was invaluable to the Southern War effort, as the college was transformed into a munitions manufacturer during the Civil War. He was the last Confederate soldier at the college campus when it was surrendered to the Union on February 18, 1865. His grandson, Hume Batiste, is of that lineage. He was raised on the campus of the historically black college and university, South Carolina State University. He was triracial, meaning he was white, Native American, and black. It was known as the pejorative term, known by the pejorative term, a person with brass ankles. He lost his hearing to a childhood illness, but was a gifted student, and an administrator at the public school recognized the young man's brilliance and penned a letter of recommendation for his admission into Gallaudet University, the only institute for higher education for the deaf-mute community in the country. Gallaudet did not admit black students. Thus began a lengthy charade as a Native American student-athlete. And this lasted for 20 years of him passing as Native American, although his family history says otherwise. Batiste's track career. He was a multi-sport star at Gallaudet, where he played football, baseball, and burned up the track centers. If accurately timed, Batiste's time of 51 seconds flat in the 400 meters would have placed him on the podium in the 1912 Helsinki Olympics. But unfortunately, his heritage caused headwinds in track circles. Like Jim Thorpe, he had entered professional baseball when a career in track did not pan out. Initially scouted by Clark Griffith of the Washington Senators, he signed a contract on the opposite coast with the 1914 Portland Colts. In the spring of 1914, the Colts played a series of exhibition games with Rube Foster and the Chicago American Giants. The Chicago American Giants were a barnstorming team that had traveled up and down the West Coast from 1913 to 16. The teams played against Santa Rosa, Chico, but mostly the Portland Colts were the main attraction that they would play on a regular basis. And the 6-game series, of those 6 games, the Portland Colts only won 1. And that was the game that Batiste pitched. And the manager of the Colts was so impressed that he had a pitcher who actually beat the Giants that he immediately signed him to a contract, not even questioning his heritage or anything else. Nick Williams was actually known as a very progressive manager. He hired a lot of Native American ball players, including the Wayner brothers and Roy Johnson and Indian Bob Johnson from Washington State. The Colts were an organization on the brink, unfortunately, and after a poor start, the owners ended up selling the team to a Ballard, Washington lumber mogul, where they became the Ballard Pippins. The lumber mogul didn't want the Native American on his team, so he was traded to Helena, and then he was traded to Calgary, so they were just shipping him right out of the country. just get him out of Dodge. But he played for the Calgary Broncos from 1914 to 18, but it was only a 6-week season there. They tried to just cram in as many seasons as they could while there was sunlight and some summer, I suppose, in the north of the border. But he must have loved the Pacific Northwest, because he ended up homesteading 160 acres in a place called Tum Tum. Tum Tum, it's a funny name, but it means heart and soul in Salish. And it's an unincorporated area that lies between the Spokane Indian Reservation and the Colville Reservation. Here he pitched for a team called the Springdale Reds. And the perennial powerhouse of the league was always Colville, because it was not only the county seat, but they had Ike Ward, the 25th Infantry pitcher, on their mound as a kind of a ringer. But when tiny Springdale, with only 250 people, ended up with Batiste, they could match firearms with the bigger brothers. The Springdale Reds enjoyed 2 seasons of success. His most successful season with the Springdale Reds was in 1915. He won 11 games, lost only 4, hit .263, had 102 strikeouts and 107 innings pitched, and threw 2 complete shutouts. Batiste was the cornerstone of the rotation, the only pitcher essentially on the Springdale Reds, and there were really no replacements on that team. They ended up playing the Colville team in 1916 with only 7 players because 2 were injured while playing the game. So they ended up having to only have 1 outfielder and move the shortstop from the short right or short left and had him play that way. But Batiste was such an effective pitcher, they still won the game 6-4. So quite the impressive accomplishment. World War I, of course, a lot of the eligible age men were drafted, and with Springdale, as shorthanded as they already were, they were unable to field a team. So he went and played for the Ephrata Tigers, and then for 1 season with the Spokane Indians. Nick Williams, his former manager in Portland, managed the Spokane Indians in 1918. So when he realized that Batiste was available, he hired him immediately, and Batiste was the opening day starter for the Spokane Indians in 1918. His luck was terrible, though. The Spokane Indians folded just a month later. So in less than 5 years, 2 teams that Batiste was on, managed by Nick Williams, were either sold or folded, and Batiste was out of luck. But after the war, most jobs on the mound, on the baseball field, were again filled by returning soldiers coming back from the front. So he lost a lot of his spots with any possibility of the Northwestern League. He ended up moving across the country to Akron, Ohio, where he played for a team, a really unique team called the Goodyear Mutes. The Goodyear Mutes was an entirely deaf-mute baseball team. All 9 positions were deaf-mute baseball players, either graduates of Ohio State School for the Deaf or Gallaudet University. They barnstormed all around the country. The Goodyear Tire Manufacturing Company had found that deaf-mute workers were excellent employees because of just the loud conditions that they constantly had to work under in the rubber factory. After his 1 year with the Goodyear Mutes, he opened up a Goodyear tire store in Minden, Nebraska, where he lived for the remainder of his days. This is a picture of him in Minden, playing with the Minden, Nebraska team. Now, Batiste's miraculous career and accomplishments should be well known to baseball historians. Here's a deaf-mute African-American baseball player who integrated teams on the West Coast, but for some reason it's just not known or shared or recognized. The same can be said about this man. His name is Jimmy Claxton. The exhaustive list of Claxton's accomplishments include he was the first African-American featured on a baseball card to hurl a no-hitter in an integrated game. He was one of the first to integrate semi-pro and minor league teams in Seattle, Tacoma, Portland, Reno, Oakland, and I could go on and on down that list because he played everywhere. He played in 49 of the 50 states. He somehow did not play in Texas at any time in his career. His nearly 50-year baseball career spanned the coal and atomic age. He began to play against grown men at the age of 13 and pitched his final game at the age of 62. It would be really impossible to cover his entire career without dragging this out into the wee hours of the morning. So we'll just talk about 3 years of his career. 1916, 1924, 1929. Claxton was one of the most well-known African-American ball players from the Pacific Northwest. He began his career as a left-handed catcher. Those familiar with baseball know that a left-handed catcher is already an anomaly, let alone a black left-handed catcher, which made it even more peculiar for the league. He began his career in the town of Franklin, Washington, which is a ghost town now. It used to be a coal mining town in the Green River Gorge area. They played on the Cascade Coal Leagues with Cleellum, Roslyn, Enumclaw, Ravensdale, Buckley, Carbonado, any of those coal mining or lumber industry towns. They all fielded a baseball team. Any small little village that had more than 9 men in it fielded a baseball team. I mean, Vesey, Kangley, Comer, Crane, towns that I've never even heard of, and I grew up in the area. And I've never heard of hardly any of these towns or players until further research enlightened me. In his first game at the age of 19 on the mound as a pitcher, Claxton struck out 18 players. His curveball mowed down hitters like a chainsaw through dandelions. He struck out 23 batters in a 9-inning ball game. He did that twice. So only 4 people even put wood on the ball in order to record an out. Everybody else he struck out. Just go sit down. Have a good thing. He struck out 18 on 3 consecutive starts. His 138 wins were the most by an African-American pitcher against integrated competition until the great Satchel Paige. If you needed a bat in your lineup, he had a lifetime .350 batting average. Claxton held the Washington State semi-professional record for most consecutive hits at 13 hits. That means for 13 times at the plate, he had 13 consecutive hits. The Major League Baseball record for that is 12. In 1916, he attracted the attention of the Pacific Coast League Oakland Oaks while pitching for the local black baseball team, the Oakland Oak Leafs. By mid-May, he had 6 wins, 1 loss, and 88 strikeouts in just 44 innings. So he was striking out 2 batters per inning at every game he was pitching. It was preposterous numbers, things that are impossible to do almost. The Oaks were bereft of left-handed pitching talent, and after 2 tryouts signed the young African-American. They laughably tried to pass him as a Native American from Minnesota. They actually had a bunch of different cover stories, and none of them jived with one another. He was an Osage Port Sider, he was from Minnehaha, or it was a big farce. And they could never get their stories straight. But people who are familiar with baseball circles, they knew who Jimmy Claxton was. Here he is with the 1914 Hubbard Giants. So he'd been on the West Coast playing between Portland and Oakland for the previous 2 seasons with black baseball teams. This is Jimmy Claxton right here. And this is Dale Hubbard was his name. He's kind of a bootlegger, a sketchy character. But he made his professional baseball debut on May 28th, 1916 versus the Los Angeles Angels. His performance that day was not up to his usual standards, and newspapers noted that he looked wild and nervous on the mound. His stat line was 2 2/3 innings, 3 runs allowed, 1 earned, with a no decision. He also pitched the final out of Game 2 for some reason, but was summarily dismissed that week by management without any other further explanation, but I think everybody has an idea of exactly what the reasoning was. Many theories exist as to exactly how and why they let him go. In a 1964 interview, Claxton claimed that manager Rowdy Elliott sabotaged his efforts to integrate. In a freak occurrence, the opponent on that mound, of all people, you're pitching in Oakland, and of all people, his opponent that day on the mound for the Los Angeles Angels was a gentleman named Pete Standridge, who was from Enumclaw, of all places, just across the river from Franklin, and they were both about the same age. So it would be really difficult to, it would strain credulity to think that they didn't know each other. They probably had a history of some type on a baseball field somewhere. Claxton ended up playing for 4 more years in California for different black baseball teams where he excelled. He played for the Oak Leafs, the Shasta Limiteds, the Godfrey All-Stars, and the Los Angeles White Sox. Apparently, or it's rumored, I haven't been able to find confirmation of this, but it's rumored that he won 38 of 42 starts with the Los Angeles White Sox. So he went 38-4 that season. It's just preposterous. He moved to, in 1924, Jimmy Claxton ended up moving back to Washington State. He moved here with his wife and their infant son, where he joined and integrated the longshoremen stevedores of Tacoma Industrial League. He and his brother-in-law, Ernie Tanner, did that, so both of the African Americans integrated the Tacoma Industrial League at the same time. That was strange enough, but on June 22nd, 1924, Claxton pitched the first no-hitter in a fully integrated game versus the 23rd Street Skidoos of the Tacoma Industrial League. He struck out 10, helped his own cause at the plate by going 2 for 5 and had 2 stolen bases. He was the whole show for the longshoremen. And for his efforts and tremendous achievement, he was dismissed from the league. If it's possible to be fired for being too good, he was. He was then signed by the Seattle Waterfronters, which was the same type of industrial league in the Seattle area, but pitched just 1 game for them, a 3-2 victory over Union Oil. Union Oil protested the game on the grounds that African Americans were banned. The July 17th Seattle Daily Times commented, Jimmy Claxton, a colored pitcher, worked the game for the Waterfront Club, and he is the cause of the protest. The city leaguers, according to the evidence at the meeting, passed a rule at the start of the season barring players of color. But the Waterfront team entering the league at a later date were ignorant of the ruling. Claxton is barred from further competition. So they literally got rid of him. Once again, just as Tacoma did. This is all 1 season. This is just 1924. This is within 2 weeks of each episode. He throws a no-hitter, is kicked out of a league for doing it, and then goes to another league where he's immediately kicked out for also beating their Union Oil team, which was a league leader at the time. It needs to be emphasized that Claxton continuously attempted to integrate baseball at a time when an estimated 1/5 of the white male population in the United States was a member of the KKK. Claxton had no patience for anyone who hurled racial epithets in his direction. He once beamed 4 players in a single inning. One of his former teammates he plunked twice in the same frame. He broke a man's jaw while trying to catch him off first base. And anyone who dared to charge the mound was greeted by the former professional boxer's skills in the squared circle. He used to be a professional boxer. His record was 1-1 as a professional. And were promptly pounded into the ground like tent pegs. With that said, he was not all spit and cuss. He wasn't that type of individual at all. In fact, he was very religious. His father was a deacon of the AME Church in Roslyn for nearly 40 years and is buried up at Mount Olivet Cemetery in Roslyn. He was dedicated to his faith and contributed time and energy to the church his entire life. In mid-July, he pitched for the Yakima Colored Giants in an exhibition game versus the minor league Ellensburg Hawks right here in town, in order to once again raise funds for the AME Church, which was in debt again after another 12 years. The Hawks were led by future New York Yankee Rookie of the Year Roy Johnson, who played alongside Ruth and Garrick after 3 seasons with our humble local aggregate here, the Ellensburg Hawks. Unfortunately, the event was not a great success, and the AME church shuttered its doors the following year, 1925. Now, Claxton still needed a job on the mound. This is still 1924. Claxton finished 1924 on one of the most unique teams ever assembled in semi-pro history in Edmonds, Washington. The Edmonds Nine may be the first men's semi-pro team led by a female manager. This lady right here, Mrs. Emma Howe. She led the Edmonds team for 16 years.
Wow.
So she was familiar with the dugout, that's for sure. And familiar with the game too. Well, she knew when she had great talent on the mound. Claxton and Mrs. Emma Howe together won the 1925 Snohomish County Independent Championship. Unfortunately, Claxton, after that season, that's just 4 different teams in 1924 that he played for, or was forced to play for, because of the color of his skin. He ended up eventually coming back to Roslyn in 1926, where he was appointed the town manager. This is Roslyn baseball field in 1925, if you can believe it. The grandstand itself was built in 1923. The same grandstand building techniques were used as at the rodeo. Both of them were built in the same year. The same contractors did the jobs. The once great ballpark was torn down in the late 60s and cannibalized for local building materials. But a person can easily imagine the huge grandstand when you go to Pioneer Park, even today. And the baseball diamond is in the west corner of the park now, but that massive grandstand there, it's actually marked by a Masonic marker. It's on the corner of Washington and 3rd Street. That indicates exactly where the grandstand was put by the Prince Hall Masonic Society, the African American Masonic Order in Roslyn, on April 6, 1923. So he comes to Roslyn to pitch for the Roslyn Yippers, right? The Yippers. Why the Yippers? What is a Yipper? You know, so many teams have familiar names. The Roslyn team had the Yippers. And the reason for the Yippers was this woman here. Her name was Miss Artie Woods. She was a local sports fanatic. You can't see it in this image, but that dress that she's wearing is actually made of stamps. So, a unique craftsman too, but she was most known as a bootlegger. And the term Yipper was one of 2 things. She used to sit behind home plate and would constantly give a mule call, you know, yip, 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 and, you know, in order to encourage the team at the field. But it also may have been a reference to her hard-boiled liquor, that the patrons' reaction after they drank it. Yip, yip, yip. Either way, I'm not too sure. But that's where the origin of the term Yippers comes from. It's directly from her. The 1929 Roslyn Yippers. At the age of 36, Jimmy Claxton had perhaps the greatest season of baseball of his entire career. The Yippers won 19 games and lost just 3 to secure a berth in the Washington State Semi-Pro Championship. It was David versus Goliath in the championship, as tiny Roslyn, with a population of 2,500, faced the Seattle Hellos, the best semi-pro team in a town of nearly 350,000. So you can see the David and Goliath. The Hellos managed to contain the Yippers' juggernaut offensive attack. It was a fantastic offensive attack, especially with Claxton batting cleanup. They held him in check for 10 innings in a 2-2 ball game until a crucial fielding error cost Roslyn the Washington State Championships. 3-2, they lost that game. Claxton seasons in Roslyn came to an ignoble end when a contract dispute between management and Claxton led to trouble. The management attempted to publicly humiliate their star pitcher in order to force him into negotiations. They hired a white man to pitch in blackface at their 1930 season opener. The joke fell flat on the Claxton family, and Claxton was out of town and made arrangements in order to move to Nevada the next year. He integrated teams in Washington, Oregon, California, and Nevada well before Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier. His 1916 Z-Nut baseball card is one of the most sought-after collectibles in the hobby and commands a hefty price tag. The last example of his 1916 Z-Nut baseball card fetched a price of $8,000 6 years ago, just for a little chunk of cardboard. He's most well known for his baseball card, but his career certainly wasn't reducible to that. That was just the tip of the iceberg. The 1944 Hanford Eagles. This is William Alexander Sr. He was from St. Mary Parish, Louisiana, and grew up as a sharecropper in that area. He was drafted by United States Marine Corps July 24th, 1942. Only 1 month earlier, the U.S. Marine Corps had enlisted their first African American, so he was one of the first. After boot camp, he was assigned to the secretive Hanford nuclear facility in Hanford, Washington. Built almost overnight, the Hanford facility immediately attracted more than 50,000 people. It became the third largest city in Washington state in a matter of 6 months. There were 6,000 African Americans hired in order to do the construction and labor work at the Hanford facility. Most residents were unaware of their important mission, the development, of course, of the atomic bomb. To keep idle workers and soldiers from self-destructive behavior, camp commanders formed a Sunday baseball league. One of those teams was the Hanford Eagles. It was the only African-American entrant into the 8-team league. After a slow start, the first half of the season, this gentleman here, William Alexander, found an ace pitcher, battery mate, named Elmer Fireman Hester. They immediately clicked, and they improved to a 7-0 record over the second half, and faced the first half champion, which was the Crane and Rigging crew. That championship lasted for 3 games. It was a split 1 game, and the third game was attended by over 5,000 people at the Hanford facility. Remember, these people are locked in to this facility. They can't leave, so the only entertainment there really is, well, let's go to the baseball game. So 5,000 people at this baseball game. After the championship game, the government had flown in an all-star team of American leaguers and National Leaguers from Major League Baseball in order to play an exhibition game after their game. So that was a pretty important role for them. Now, black laborers at Hanford, unfortunately, the war, of course, the dropping of the bomb in Hiroshima, the surrender of Germany, it didn't necessitate that many employees at the Hanford Nuclear Reservation, and by 1950, all black laborers were gone from Hanford. As many as 6,000 were there just 4 years earlier. They were already gone within 5 years. The nearby town of Kennewick was what was known as a sundown town. It was known as a sundown town until the late 1960s. There was a sign posted on the old green bridge that said, "People of color are not welcome in our community after dark." And people who were there, who were African American, were subjected to harassment and imprisonment. It's really important that these type of events, the civil rights movement around the Tri-Cities was critically important. The civil rights leader that led marches in Pasco in 1963 in order to protest the Kennewick town policy was a gentleman named Judge Jack Tanner, and he just happened to be Jimmy Claxton's nephew. Now, Judge Tanner was the first African-American federal judge ever appointed west of the Mississippi. So he was definitely a pioneer into his own right. He just did it from a different bench. Claxton had the bench in the ballpark, the other person there. Here in Ellensburg, this wasn't the only place. Kennewick and other towns, Wenatchee was particularly bad. Of course, Yakima had KKK rallies in the 1920s. But here in Ellensburg, 1 week short of his 100th birthday, Reverend Jimmy Gratton, a former member of that 1912 Ellensburg baseball team with John Golden, he passed away. The January 29, 1960 Ellensburg Daily Record article describes what happened to his family in town, and this is a pretty familiar theme with families throughout Central Washington. Several years ago, Mrs. Gratton and their children moved to Seattle to be near other Negro children their own age, and to seek greater opportunities than could be found here with people of their own race. Sadly, this was the case in the once thriving communities throughout Central Washington, once thriving black communities throughout Central Washington. And while these men will not be found in Cooperstown or even at the Negro League Museum in Kansas City, their achievements were not confined to the chalk lines of a baseball diamond. Jackie Robinson Day is only 4 days away, April 14th, or April 15th, when all Major League Baseball players wear the number 42 in honor of the Dodger Hall of Famer. I'd like to emphasize that this retired number stands for more than just Robinson's career, but the many players before him who were not given the opportunity to play on a level field. Thank you very much. And, any questions? Comments?
That was amazing.
Anything? Sure.
So considering the time and travails of getting around this country in 1919, say, how many games did they play in a year? Couldn't be very many.
They typically played here in Ellensburg and in Kittitas County. They played every Sunday. Sunday afternoons at the ballpark were religion. The games were always well attended, but they would usually start in early April. A lot of the early April games, of course, were rained out, but they would play until late September. So they'd get about 25 to 30 weeks in. And they would only have one starting pitcher, so he'd get about 25 to 30 starts per year, which is about the average for a major league starter now, too.
Where did they play in Ellensburg?
They actually played at Ellensburg Ballpark until from, wait, hold on, let me go back into Ellensburg history here. In 1898, they actually played behind where the Opera House used to be next door. Okay. They were kicked off that field because they kept on breaking windows in the Opera House. And there was even a petition to ban baseball in Ellensburg in 1899, started by a local reverend. But that never panned out, so they moved them way out of town. And their baseball field used to be located where the China Inn is now, or the Chinese restaurant that's down there by McDonald's. That huge pasture out there, that was the original Ellensburg baseball field. They played there until 1923 when the rodeo grounds were built. So then they moved the baseball games to the rodeo grounds. I couldn't imagine playing in a dirtier field than the rodeo grounds. Dusty mess, like just, you know, all the dirt swirling around, and of course the Ellensburg wind, and the conditions had to be horrid. A lot of the fields in the area, they weren't the most well-maintained. The field in Wapato is once described as the most luxurious field of alfalfa ever seen. That was the baseball field. Another field in Zila, they had constant injuries at the field because they had tied down the bases with wire mesh. So when people went diving into the bases, hands first, their fingers were mangled by the wire mesh on the base path. So we're not talking about optimal playing conditions here. We call them suboptimal, but still, every unique ballpark had its own personality to it. The Roslyn baseball field, its probably unique characteristic was the stream that runs behind the baseball field back there. There was no outfield fence at Roslyn Baseball Park, so it would go, if you hit a drive 600 yards, 600 feet out there, it's going to go in the creek, but you can still retrieve it. And so there's stories of 40-year-old fat men trying to get around the bases, just dying, and all the troubles that came from that. The town team, the small town team baseball stories were always the best because they always have the most range of characters in them. I mean, you can find the mayor on the town, and the town drunk on the same team. So it's really like a combination, and sometimes it was good and sometimes it wasn't. Anyone? Sure.
What stimulated your interest in this?
This subject.
Yes.
Okay, I started on a project about 8 years ago with Milton Waggy at the Ellensburg Public Library in order to record baseball history from its beginning in Kittitas County all the way through the 1950s. So we collected all the microfiche that we could find and assembled a huge file. And I kept on finding tidbits, just little nuances in there. It's like, oh, who's this person, Jimmy Claxton? Or, who is this African-American baseball player they're referencing here? And it would only come up once or twice, but it was always more interesting to me to find those little tidbits and then to assemble all those scraps together into a usable home, rather than just like picking up a newspaper and reading the box score. Anyone else? I've got my book, Darkhorse, the Jimmy Claxton Story. It's available for sale. It's also available on Amazon Kindle. So if you have a Kindle device, you feel free to pick that up. And if there's any other further questions, feel free. Is there anybody here who used to watch baseball games down here at the Ellensburg, when the Ellensburg Cowboys were in town? No? Oh, if anybody's familiar with the Ellensburg Cowboys, they know that Dean Nicholson used to play for that team in the early 1950s. Leo Nicholson started that. So baseball is just really tied into just about every small community throughout Central Washington. The Yakima team especially was beyond colorful. I didn't want to go into the Yakima baseball team too much because it was really controversial. The first black baseball team there was the 1907 Yakima Black Stockings. Their starting pitcher, William Knox, was convicted of attempted murder in 1910. Their first baseman, Arthur Caldwell, he was assaulted by a group of black pimps known as the Colored Dude Brigade in Yakima. That was a little strange. In the 1920s, they had a person that came through there named Tom Circus Mooney. Circus was named after he got his nickname from a troupe of traveling pachyderms that used to play baseball. They give elephants huge bats and balls. And so the Mooney Giants, so he got his nickname Circus Mooney from that. But he was a great pitcher. He integrated the 1925 Indians. But his most successful, or I won't say successful, but one of his more unique stories was in 1922, he pitched for the Yakima Police Department team, integrated them. That's pretty unheard of considering he was just a supervisor of the ballpark, not a member of the police department by any stretch of the imagination, but they wanted to win baseball games. So let's just win baseball games out on track. And during a raid in the restricted district in Yakima, they arrested their starting pitcher for rolling dice one night. So he had to face the judge the next morning, and paid him fine and explained to his teammates exactly what happened that day. In 1937 in Yakima, a Hall of Famer named Willie Foster started a team there called the Washington Browns. They were a traveling team. Willie Foster is the brother of Rube Foster, who founded the Negro Leagues in 1920. The Washington Browns were an outstanding outfit, but they didn't play in Yakima per se. That was just their home field, home ground, what have you. And they only went to that ballpark because Parker Field was built that year. So it was a brand new ballpark to play in, and let's break it in. So that was the Washington Browns. That was a totally different team. But there's a lot of black baseball history in Yakima that I didn't cover, and it's amusing at times, to say the least.
Where did the laborers from Hanford, did they just dissipate all over the country? Because Yakima did have a lot, and I'm wondering if they went more to the Yakima area.
Quite a few, and East Pasco was another area where they were allowed to live. There wasn't as strict or standards on the restricted district after the war, but most of them moved, such as William Alexander, the catcher, and Elmer Fireman Hester. They moved back to their homes. Alexander moved back he actually moved to Port Arthur, Texas, and lived there for 28 years, where he worked for the Gulf Port Shipyard. So most of them moved back home, unfortunately. 6,000 people though. So they would hire them in when they were necessary. And then once they had fulfilled their usefulness, it was, let's make a rule so that they can't participate, they can't go to the roller rinks, they can't use this facility, blah, blah, blah. Just in order to make it more miserable. So they would move to towns like Seattle and Tacoma, and where the restricted districts weren't as powerful. So they moved, there was a huge transition from rural to urban African American culture. Excellent.
Oh.